I'm Mike AD, and welcome to the Delta League Podcast, Week 15. Delta League, the only sport in which 3 teams play at the same time. And now, down the stretch they come. We are now in the last 3 weeks of the regular season, with the Wheel of Fire tournament rapidly approaching. Now, let's get on with the action, and we'll start in the nation's capital, with the Washington Power playing host to Los Angeles and Miami. And in this one, Los Angeles picks up a close win. LA 25, Washington 24, Miami 17. Now, leading the way for Washington, it was Elix Henderson with 7 goals. For Los Angeles, it was Frank Viano with 8 goals. And for Miami, it was Marquette Weaver, Shinsuke Katayama, and Bob Nyhan with 3 goals each. And in the end of this one, Los Angeles picks up the 4 points. Washington, 2 points. Miami, 0. Let's move on now to Toronto, where the Titans play host to Vancouver and Salt Lake City. And in this one, Vancouver wins it. Vancouver 29, Toronto 25, Salt Lake City 19. Vancouver assistant captain D.D. Christopherson was late to practice, but it didn't matter if he was chasing down a pickpocket or getting a chicken McNugget combo. He was benched for the first period. Now, after a horrific first period, the Vancouver team captain Jonathan Monopoly banished the coaching staff and had a players-only meeting, stating that he was not happy at all with the inconsistency and they need to be the team they know they can be. And you saw the results. Vancouver needs to be more like the early season Orcas and less like the Orcas that we've seen down the stretch. Now, Vancouver player Romeo DeRosa came to the court with a brand new handlebar mustache, which the crowd jeered at every opportunity. But since the Orcas won, call it a lucky mustache. There were several calls online for the Vancouver Orcas to have a new ownership group, but this was linked to another group from Calgary who would really like a Delta League franchise as well. That's not how you do it. You buy the team. You don't pilfer someone else's team. For the Toronto Titans, leading the way was North Malikian with 5 goals. For the Orcas, it was Andy Alway with 7 goals. And for Salt Lake City, it was Reggie Joag Dev with 5 goals. And in the end of this one, Vancouver picks up the 4 points. Toronto, 2 points. Salt Lake City, 0. Now, let's move on to Chicago, where the Pride are hosting the Seattle Pirates and the Phoenix Rising. And in this one, an extremely tight game. Chicago picks up the win. Chicago 34, Seattle 32, Phoenix also 32. Phoenix assistant captain Jackson Truman came out as extremely critical of the officiating in a post-game interview. He said, "I think the refs must have some bets on Chicago because we were hosed on some calls tonight." I really didn't see the refs calling anything. There were nearly 100 goals scored in this game. It's one of the most exciting games I've seen in a long time. And to see the underdog Chicago pull this out over two superior teams, it made me happy to see, and the crowd definitely got their money's worth. Now, with the 1 point Seattle got from this shared loss, they clinched the Premiership Shield. But because Philly played first and Memphis could not secure the 4 points, the shared loss was all they needed. Not the circumstances they would have hoped for, but the record this team has accumulated has been impressive. After the game, Darcy DeMello came out and presented the team with the Premiership, and the Chicago crowd was pretty appreciative. And I have to say, that trophy is pretty cool. The team looked pretty excited to have achieved this, but remember, all that matters in the end is that Delta League Cup in 3 weeks' time. Now, former Montreal captain and current Chicago Pride player Kipper Grimmett was late for practice too. There was no excuse that the coach would believe. Unfortunately, this club is so riddled with injuries that it couldn't afford to sit him on the bench, so he has been fined. Now, Seattle player Evan Parawal left the game early with a strained wrist, but like normal, miss 0 time. So, for Chicago leading the way, Dos Hawthorne with 9 goals. For Seattle, it was mental patient Rob Donoff, 8 goals. And for the Rising, it was Curly Barnabani with 9 goals. And in the end of this one, Chicago picks up the 4 points. Seattle, 1 point. Phoenix, also 1 point. Let's now move on to Detroit, where the Rock host Dallas and New York. And in this one, Dallas picks up the win. Dallas 22, New York 20, Detroit 17. Controversy as Detroit fans started using a racial slur on New York player Sancho Pastore. Be careful, Sancho. Remember when you used that racial slur on a white guy? The wheel of fire comes around to burn you. This doesn't excuse the bigotry, it just illustrates the fact that although Delta fans are retarded, they have a good memory. Now, a fat female streaker harassed the New York bench in this game, but she was taken out by the Detroit mascot, Floyd Rose. The replay is pretty funny. Now, for Detroit, leading the way, Argenta Mignani, 5 goals. For the Lone Stars, it was Bernie Tully with 6 goals. And for the Fire Demons, it was Ruben Nygaard with 6 goals. And in the end of this one, Dallas picks up the 4 points. New York, 2 points. Detroit, 0. Now, let's move on to Montreal, Quebec, where the Maelstrom are hosting Denver and Atlanta. And in this one, Denver stays hot. Denver wins this one. Denver 24, Atlanta 20, Montreal 17. Denver assistant captain Randy Magnuson came out after this game and criticized the officiating, saying if it wasn't for some blown penalty calls, we could have won by more. But we'll take the win. I understand Denver have had a good stretch here, so don't get all arrogant because you're 1 loss from losing it all. Now, Atlanta player Casey Dobrichka must have done something to raise the ire of Montreal fans because they jumped the barricade and went after her. On second thought, Delta players don't have to do anything in particular to raise the ire of our fan base. They just snap, and on select occasions get their asses kicked. Now, Atlanta player Hedy Fenich was nearly tackled by a fat female streaker. She is apparently in love with him. Now, Denver player Samson Sartell made a reputation for himself by getting suspended multiple times. Decides today that today is the day to take in the game. What happens? Ball goes out of bounds. He gets in the face of Montreal captain John Stein. Jumps on the court. They spill around the court area, and the guy gets black carded again. Now, for the Maelstrom, it was J.J. Syverson with 6 goals. For Denver, it was Emil Saffron with 5 goals. And for Atlanta, it was Eduardo Steven with 6 goals. And in the end of this one, Denver gets the 4 points. Atlanta, 2 points. Montreal, 0. Now, let's move on last here to Philadelphia, where the Shred are hosting Boston and Memphis. And Philadelphia also stays hot. Philadelphia 25, Memphis also 25, Boston 19. A female streaker went after Memphis player Cash Morganella, and this was not a garden variety streaker. Smokin'! Well, she's going to regret this because she runs towards him, he falls and fractures his orbital bone. He's gone 12 weeks. He's out for the playoffs, and she's going to be facing some kind of assault charge here. Just brutal timing for the Shred. Now, for Philadelphia, leading the way, it was Jack Ith and Ariel Vignola with 6 goals each. For the Revolution, it was Lord Matthew with 5 goals. And for Memphis, it was Bert Town with 7 goals. And in the end of this one, Philadelphia picks up 3 points. Memphis also 3 points. Boston, not even a tea party. Nothing. Now, let's move on to the standings. At the top of the table here, it's Seattle, 51 points. Memphis, 43 points. Vancouver, 42 points. New York, 39 points. Toronto, 36 points. Phoenix, 34 points. Washington, 33 points. Dallas, 31 points. Philadelphia, 28 points. And the playoff line is drawn there. Under there, it was Atlanta losing that tiebreaker, also 28 points. Los Angeles, 27 points. Chicago and Detroit, 26 points each. Montreal, 25 points. Denver, 24 points. Boston, 21 points. Salt Lake City, 19 points. Miami, still 7 points. Now, after this week of action, Vancouver, New York, and Toronto have clinched playoff berths, and Salt Lake City has been eliminated from playoff contention. There are now 4 places open for the Wheel of Fire, with 11 teams competing for those spots. Now, so much of what happens in the postseason is contingent upon what Philly does. If Philly loses, every team beneath them is given life, especially if they win. Now, let's look at the current playoff picture with first seed Seattle versus 4th seed New York. versus 9th seed Philadelphia. In the second game, it's 2 seed Memphis versus 5th seed Toronto versus 8th seed Dallas. And in the third game, it's 3rd seed Vancouver versus 6th seed Phoenix versus 7th seed Washington. Now, let's move on to the scoring lead. Leading the way, Evan Parawal from Seattle, 72 goals. Vladimir Millet from Seattle, 71 goals. Dos Hawthorne, Chicago, 65 goals. Tommy Anastos, Seattle, 64 goals. Chevy Colella, Washington, 63 goals. Star Palmer, Chicago, 60 goals. Laurie Moss, Seattle, 58 goals. Nathaniel Mansfield, Dallas, 57 goals. Nan Freeling, Phoenix. Gerard Sredell, Memphis. And Angela Carlucci, Montreal, 55 goals each. And Demetrius Lindbergh from Phoenix, 54 goals. Let's take a look at the league news before we open up the mailbag. Los Angeles Fallen Angels captain Eric Rob Nicholson has stepped down from the captaincy. He wants to explore a new role with the team that doesn't include leading it. It's been pretty en vogue this season for captains to be fired or step down, with around half a dozen or so far this year. So that doesn't surprise me in the slightest. There is no word if LA will name a new captain, but they will likely play out the string and decide on a new captain in the off-season. Now, there were some rumors this week that the Detroit Rock franchise was going to relocate. Perhaps this is the same group of people that preached for the relocation of the Vancouver Orcas franchise to Calgary. Well, word of the relocation reached GM Mike Facciolo's ears, and he went right on Twitter saying, quote, "Anyone tries to relocate the Rock, I will relocate their ass." Now, Philadelphia player Ariel Vignola has gone down with appendicitis after game time. He'll be gone for at least the last 2 regular season games. Now, Boston player Grant Naun, who's already out for the rest of the season, has come down with tennis elbow. I wonder what the hell he was doing at home. Now, meaning he's gone for the better part of 6 months. Now, on to the mailbag, and we've only got one this week before we move on to next week's games and predictions. This one's from Real TJ. What is the format for this Wheel of Fire tournament? Well, we've already discussed the seeds in the tournament and who will be playing who, but this tournament is a 1-weekend, 9-team single elimination tournament, and very much like the Super Bowl, it's being hosted in one city every year. This year, it's in Toronto. So, I hope you updated your passports and leave enough time to get to the games, because the traffic in the downtown core is balls. Now, the semifinal games will be Friday night, Saturday matinee, and a Saturday evening game. The championship game will be Sunday. Now, having all these crazy fans in the city is going to be wild. Now, let's move on to next week's games and predictions for week 16. We'll start in LA, where the Fallen Angels will host New York and Washington. Last week, New York clinched a playoff berth, so not much is on the line for them other than a playoff seed of doom. But for Washington, a win would get them inches from the wheel of fire. And based on how they played in the first few months of the season, this is a remarkable achievement that they're within kicking distance of the wheel of fire. LA's chances are dependent on them winning this game and everyone else laying a turd. Now, let's move on to Vancouver, where the Orcas host Miami and Atlanta. Miami has been down and out since week 8. They're playing for pride, and a win would give the players and the fans some positive affirmation. Atlanta has been garbage since Bello Hess's funeral, so I'm taking Vancouver to pick up the win and maintain their top 3 standing. Now, let's move on to Salt Lake City, who will be hosting Chicago and Montreal. Salt Lake City was eliminated last week, so the best they can do is play spoiler here. Chicago, who had a October from hell, has started to put wins together, and if they win this week, they'll be in 8th place. Montreal just keep defying positive expectations as their season goes into a tailspin, so I'm taking the Pride to make this a memorable week 17 for all the Marbles. Now, let's move on to Phoenix, where the Rising will be hosting Seattle and Denver. Seattle only seems to have one bad game out of 7, and last week wasn't really that bad. They came out with 1 point in a game with a 4-point spread. Denver has been looking up at the standings for the entire year. Funny that they pick 3 weeks to go to start playing better. They need a win and Philadelphia a loss to keep the dream alive. Plus, they have Seattle and Phoenix to put up with. And though I'd like for them to inch a little closer with 1 game to go, this is a gargantuan mountain to climb. Now, on to Dallas, where the Lone Stars are hosting Boston and Memphis. Memphis has no reason not to win here and pick up 4 points. Boston somehow is still in this thing, but I think it's only until this week where the vine wilts and dies. Now, Dallas is in a playoff position here, and if they get 4 points here, they're going through. But it's going to take a remarkable twist of fate for the Lone Stars to not make the postseason. Now, lastly, we'll move on to Toronto, where the Titans will be hosting the Detroit Rock and the Philadelphia Shred. And Toronto has been on again, off again lately, and last week they clinched a playoff berth despite themselves. They can play so much better than this, and I think this week they give their home crowd something to cheer for. Detroit only seems to put in an effort when it's too late. They put up some serious numbers, so there's always a threat to pick up 2 points. Last week, Philly lost Ariel Vignola, a trade deadline pickup that was really working for the team in its questionable condition. Now, despite that, Philly has pushed themselves through on will alone, and they're in a playoff position right now. They cannot afford a letdown that everyone knows is coming. This could be the week when they say goodbye to the Shred until next season. That's it for the Delta League podcast. Join us next week where the action continues and never stops. See ya.